as G may know, if you've seen the show, I've been collecting images for a long time, and a big part of what I do, I guess, is just compiling images. And it's not, I mean, it's kind of like, it's been all basically rationalized now as part of my practice, but I can't honestly say it had anything to do with any kind of practice. It was just more in the realm of like, neurotic behavior that I've sort of kind of been exhibiting since I was a kid, I guess. Like, it's so funny, I was just down in Mississippi a few weeks ago, and we were, me and maybe 4 people were with me, and we had some equipment with us, and they were starting to pack the trunk. And one person started laughing and said, "You guys should just stop, because AJ has to pack the trunk. If I don't pack the trunk, I get really disturbed." And it's been like this since I was like 6 years old, basically. It's like a Tetris kind of thing, It has to be, like, even when I was a kid, if it wasn't packed right, I would be really disturbed. So from 6 on, my dad would just let me pack the trunk. I know it sounds crazy, but, and like, essentially, what can you do with that, Can you be the best trunk packer in the world or something? But it's fundamentally the same thing as organizing images. I realize that. It's just that because I quote unquote am an artist now, it's been sort of incorporated as a kind of productive activity, let's say. But being attracted to images and then wanting them to put them in some order where they seem right, a lot of it has to do with that. So I had not conceived of Apex as a film or as art or anything like that. It was basically just like I have literally thousands of files. Like I have 65,000 images on my phone. Yeah. So, it's just, I put things in that file that I was interested in, and in a certain kind of way, if you put 2 things in, then you put 3 things in, they start to create their own internal logic. And at a certain point, I was sort of developing this film idea. I had a script, and then it sort of started being that. It started to be the images that went along with the story idea that I was developing. But I just became like very obsessed with it, like in a way. And I was just like, I got this software called Bridge, which is a software that was developed when people started taking digital images, where a photographer would go out and take like easily 1,000 images, and they had to have some way to manage those. You can't do contact sheets if you're doing 1,000 images at a time. So it's basically like, software that would allow you to lay the images out on a grid, and you could organize them in different ways. You could put them in a list, you could put them on a grid, you could scale them so that you have rows of 6 or 10 or whatever you wanted, right? And so just having stumbled onto Bridge and being a way to look at the images that were in the file as opposed to, clicking on them each individually, I started to look at the images on this grid. And as a result of that, I just started sequencing them like over and over. Like, I've never done another work where I've spent as much time sequencing as I have this. I mean, not love is the message, not anything, because this is like 3 years of obsessively moving the images around in relationship to each other. And maybe back around 2011, maybe, a friend of mine's, filmmaker Abigail Childs, was teaching a class up at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And she invited me to come up as a visiting artist just to talk to her class. And she said, "Oh, I want them to see a little bit of what your process is." And so I basically just had my computer on so they could actually see what I was doing. And I just, took them through Bridge and showed them how I could change the order and things like that. And then it's got what's called a slide mode, like a slide projection mode. And I just put it in that mode and just let it click the image at a time. And people were like, "Oh, this is incredible." And I was like, "What's incredible?" And they were like, "It's a film." And I was like, "Okay, huh." And then I guess maybe a few weeks after that, I put it on a timeline. I moved it over to Premiere. Well, actually, I didn't even do it. My friend Malik moved it over to Premiere for me, to Timeline. And we just laid that music down under it. And we were like, okay, this is something. We're not quite sure what it was. Because this was like prior to Love is a Message or Art World or anything like this. Maybe like, I don't know, a couple of years prior to that. And so it was initially just an internal document that I would just share with friends and people that I would be talking to about this film idea. So like over time, like I said, it's kind of been declared a work of art. And I kind of started to think about it in terms of like, Tatlin's Monument to the International, which was this, socialist or communist monument that was never built. It was like kind of almost impossible to build it. The confluence of economics and politics and all those other kinds of things. So it's kind of this artifact or fetish of sort for this kind of imaginary $200 million film that will kind of never get made or something.
Yeah. And compiling images, of course, I'm just going to skip ahead in this long list of images I have, because I have a couple of the books that you made before moving over to Bridge. Here's from the exhibition, some of the books you can flip through. Right. Here's a page from one of the books, because that's kind of where it started in a way, right?
Well, it started prior to that, because basically from when I was a kid, I was like cutting pictures out. I really like the first quote unquote artistic activity I can remember doing is probably 2 or 3 years old and playing with Lego blocks or Lincoln logs. This is super primitive, even before Lego blocks, the little wooden things that connected. So Lincoln logs and then Lego blocks like at 3 or 4, and just that is very much connected to packing the trunk. But I kind of have recognized that the sort of neurological impulse is pretty much the same thing. It's just, you put an image here, you put an image there, and it either works or it doesn't work. It either seems like it's in the right place or it doesn't seem like it's in the right place.
So what's the difference to you as a cinematographer as well between making a shot and repurposing an existing image? Like, how do you use that different way?
That's a very complicated question. You asked me a very sophisticated
You don't have to
question.
answer.
No, nobody's ever asked me that. Well, obviously, when you find images, so-called found images, they come with their own, I like to say quantum tethering, like they are connected relationally to all kinds of other things when they come to you. As opposed to I take a picture of you. I might have certain feelings about you, but the image itself is, it's a fresh thing. And so there's something really interesting about repurposing an image as opposed to making an image. Even I think when I am making images, I'm very much preoccupied with making an image that has the same relational density of a repurposed image. A good friend of mine is Peggy Alwish, who's an incredible filmmaker. I shot this film for her, and as a cinematographer, shot this film for her, and it took her 3 years to edit it. And I was like, what's going on, Peggy? Are you ever going to edit that thing? And at a certain point, she said something like, I have to let it sit for a while. And I realized that, like me, because she's made some also very powerful found image works, that there was something about her hand, like losing the sense of her hand on them, like them becoming, like the images having a certain kind of autonomy, independent of your presumptions about it. This whole question of a thing, a artifact, is existing outside of you and having autonomy is something that's pretty central to my kind of preoccupations. And I think that goes back to one of my central preoccupations is like the ontology of blackness or something like that. And how, and I said this to somebody earlier today, but how as a black person, and in the context of America for sure, like one is engendered into a context where you don't fit into the classical mode of subject or object. Those are in the West, that bifurcation is either you're a subject or an object. But black people are very particular kinds of things. Like I think of myself as a thing, and the question is like, what kind of thing? Because I'm not classically speaking a subject, and nor am I, classically speaking an object, because I do have a certain level of self-determinacy, but in the context of African people brought to the Americas, they were sort of inculcated into a system that structurally was telling them that they were not human beings, that they were less than human beings or animals of a sort, even though obviously we're all animals, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so it's something about, to use a term that my friend Kerry Marshall used when I asked him about the difference between painting and photography, he just said with no hesitation, discrepancy. But that term discrepancy, I think, also lies at the very core of Black being, because it's about constantly trying to negotiate the difference between who you are and how people structure you to be. Not presume you to be, but structure you to be. Because it's one thing to presume. I could have some presumptions about you, but it's not like the whole social or structural array is gonna reinforce my presumptions about you, you know? And so that's like even when people get into these conversations about racism and stuff, can Black people be racist and stuff? That's why people get into arguments about it, because like ultimately it doesn't matter what one's individual biases are. Everybody has biases. Some people like tall people, you know, some people prefer short people, skinny people, you know, thick people. But at the end of the day, it's not like your biases are not going to shape the terms and the maneuverability of that person. It's just going to shape how you interact with that person. So it's in the sort of structuring, in the whole idea that a bias has a is structured into society on some fundamental level that becomes a problem. We're never going to eliminate preference. And nor should we, because preference is the very basis of difference and change and all these other kinds of things that are great, you know? And again, I was talking to somebody like in the last couple of days, and we got into this whole conversation. Chimamanda, I can never get her last name right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. The Nigerian novelist. Yeah. She got into trouble in the last year or so, maybe a couple of years, because she made a comment casually, I think, in an interview where she said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing now, but something to the effect that trans women are not the same as cis women. I don't know if she used that term, cis women, and she got a lot of, like, you know, she got a lot of heat by it. People say she was transphobic and stuff like that. She may not be, I don't know. But I know the term, the designation, the sort of what she's pointing out, I think there's some founding for it. It's like, I think people get really disturbed around the whole question of difference. And we understand why, because it's the uses to which difference is put. Yeah. You know, in the late 80s and 90s, there was this book that came out called The Bell Curve, and I'm gonna apologize to whoever I was having this conversation with earlier. I know I'm repeating myself, but there was this book called The Bell Curve that came out, and The Bell Curve, was a conservative writer came in, and basically it was a book that was purportedly demonstrating the fact that he had done all these analyses to prove that in terms of IQs, that white people had higher IQs than Black people did. Like, to me, the whole thing was laughable, not because I necessarily agree with the conclusions that he came to. I think those are beside the point. You know, okay, you know, if let's just assume for a second it's true. I mean, even though it's super problematic, because, like, what white people, like, who's white, who's, you know what I mean? It's a very slippery slope. But let's just assume for a second there's something that we can define. This is, if you're on this side of the line, you're white. If you're on this side of the line, you're not white. Okay, just assume that for a second. We can all agree on these are the white people and these are not the white people. Okay, the white people are smarter, IQs. So you're just saying statistically that's the case. So it doesn't mean, even if that's true, that I, as a non-white person, am not smarter than everybody in this room. It just means across some sort of mean. But the reason I think people react to it is because, like I said, they are afraid of radical difference. So you hear people oftentimes will collapse the term equal and the same. They do this, it's this really peculiar slippage. People say, everybody's the same, everybody's equal. Okay, everybody is not the same. Thank God, everybody is not the same, you know? Yeah. People get nervous because in the context in which most of us exist, as I say, it's the uses to which difference and the same is put.
Yeah.
More often than not, when you see super problematic instances like the Holocaust, say, for example, the first thing that happens is they create a structural situation that seems to reinforce ideas that they want to have about German Jews. We know there's no German society without German Jews. If you extract German Jews from German history, it looks nothing like Germany. In the same way, if you extract black people from the history of America completely, it's no way that it looks anything like what America looks. But nevertheless, that malformation inside of German culture produced this situation where Germans turned on this other group of Germans and said, okay, we're gonna put you in ovens because you are X, Y, and Z. But they create the situation to structure them being X, Y, and Z. You crowd everybody into too small of a footprint. You put any human beings, you put 1 million human beings into 5 square mile radius, of course, they're gonna quote unquote exhibit behavior that seems less civilized or something like this. But it's like very, very complicated, like why this is going on. Like to me, it's more about if you're a SNS, if you're an SNS officer over a concentration camp, I think unless you structure German Jewish people as being not human, you can't effectively do that. Because even bad guys want to think of themselves as good guys, right? Nobody can effectively treat human beings as if they're not human unless they glamour or mesmerize themselves or hypnotize themselves to think that the people are actually not human or in some ways less human. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So to me, this whole question of like difference is like super, super critical for us to get a handle on, because if not, people will run away from things and make these sort of assertions that I think are like completely problematic to stand on. Everybody is not the same. But nevertheless, everybody should have the same rights and privileges of anybody else. And it shouldn't be dependent on whether you are aligned with some normative idea of what a human being or a citizen is. So it's really about just addressing the core thing as opposed to getting caught up in the symptomatics of it, I think. So,
we're going through the PowerPoint backwards, but I was thinking about this image, which is called Le Rage. And it's part of a big installation in the show called Large Array. And I was thinking about what you were just saying about this like stigmatization of certain groups.
Right.
And in your work you have several, if not many portrayals of monsters, and also you have a couple of self-portraits in the exhibition. Unfortunately, I don't think I have one in the.
That's a self-portrait.
Yeah. But could you talk a little bit about this kind of monster? What is this monster?
Well, like I said, like so much that I'm preoccupied with as I get older, as I am older now, I can understand that there's certain conceptual motifs that I continue to come back to, and the monster, as you say, is the name of one of them. Because what monsters are beings or entities that exhibit problematic relationships to boundaries. Frankenstein's monster, it's a difference between, in Shelley's book, Frankenstein's monster in the movies. Most people know Frankenstein's monsters in the movies. But the monstrousness completely comes down to the fact that he's composed of various people's bodies. In Alien, which I've talked about quite a bit, what's monstrous about the alien as an entity is the fact that it doesn't respect other boundaries. When you first see the alien in H.R. Geiger's Alien, in the beginning of the first movie, it's a little small thing and it's pink. And the next time you see it, it's a larger black thing. And the last time you see it, it's got a tail. And then, you know what I mean? It's constantly evolving. And it also doesn't respect the boundary of others. So it's like, I'm going to incubate you, regardless of what you think. But see, like that whole question of like this sort of non-consensual incubation of the other, that's so central to black being, because there's no way in which black people are, and I mean black people in distinction from African people, because all black people are of African descent, but I'm not sure all Africans are black, ontologically speaking. There are a lot of other very complicated things, but not necessarily sure they're black. And the ontological blackness is different from socio-political blackness. Of course, we know, people of African descent as black. But it all comes down to the kind of ontological fissure, like what produces you. So like, say, in the case of The Incredible Hulk, which clearly LaRage is a variation of, Bruce Banner is subjected to gamma radiations, and when he comes out of the other side of it, he's just super angry, colored dude,
Yeah.
So I get that, because it's the gamma radiation that did it. In the case of the alien in the movie and stuff, I think like at the core of Alien it's a series of interactions around what, to use the N-word, like good niggas and bad niggas. Because in that movie, there's a black guy, Yaphet Kotto, and then there's the alien. And in the very beginning, when the alien first incubates one of the crew members, and then he's very hungry, and it's that classic dinner table scene, and he falls over and he starts having a seizure, and then the alien pumps out of his chest. Like, what's so fascinating to me about that image, and I think I sort of instinctively understood it even when I was in high school and I saw the movie the first time. What's most striking about it is like everybody in the room pulls back, like recoils, when the thing pops out of the guy's chest, except for Yaphet Kotto, who doesn't recoil. He pushes forward.
Yeah.
And there's an image of the alien like this and Yaphet Kotto like this. And Yaphet Kotto is not just a black actor. He is like Brock Peters, and there was a series of black actors who had very Negroid features. So they signified blackness in a way very different from like Sidney Poitier or Harry Belafonte, who were black men but didn't quite signify Africanness in the same way. So to have this image of Yaphet Kotto facing off with this alien and have all the white people in it, the crew members holding him back as he has a knife like this, trying to kill the thing at its most nascent state. And I always thought, that's because he recognized what it was from the beginning. Like, he recognized that I'm a black person who has figured out how to get along with the system, who can actually, even though he's in the bowels of the ship with, there's a sort of hierarchy of management and workers, and him and Harry Dean Stanton are in the bowels of the ship. So they're like, the sub-basement crew, and so he recognized it for what it is quicker than anybody else, which is like, essentially that alien to me is like blackness in the white imagination that is most virulent, meaning like an entity that exists purely to contaminate, purely to depurify, like kind of the environment. Now, I think these are projections, of course, but nevertheless, you see that, like, I was not surprised when after seeing Alien, I found out like 3 years later that in this suit was a black guy. Black people can't even get work in Hollywood when they want to, especially back in the 70s. The fact that they would be shooting a movie about an alien and would find a 6'7" Sudanese brother who was an art student in the street and decide, yes, that is the cat we want in the suit. It's like, that's not an accident. That's like on some fundamental psychological level, they, for better or for worse, had access to the very idea that for all of their talking about it's an alien from some other planet and stuff, what it is sort of, an embodiment of blackness in the white imagination. So, you get this Sudanese brother in this suit, and he's moving around. And I have a clip maybe that we could show as part of the thing sort of come up. And if it comes up, you guys will know what it is. But, you get this guy in this suit. And I remember also then seeing a little bit later this picture from H.R. Geiger, who designed the monster, right? He designed the monster. And I do think it's the greatest monster in the history of cinema. I do think that. And it was a picture of this walking stick that he had in his studio. And it was a Yoruba walking stick. And it was a classic, it was a stick. And then on the head of it, it had what was Esu Legba. It was a Yoruba god, the god of interstices and crossroads, right? And just like the alien, like literally it had a head on one side and a penis on the other side. And that's what you see in the film. It's absolutely that. The teeth and all that kind of stuff. like who has fronts? Like the alien just had like hip hop, like gold fronts in his teeth and stuff, and then a penis on the back of his head. You know what I mean? So that's like literally a Yoruba god moving around in that film. So, you know, black people, quote unquote, black people, have been engendered into this structure that is psychotic. It is psychotic. And some other ramifications of it are things like racism and stuff like this. But that's not the only ramifications of it. It does all this other weird stuff to you psyche-wise in terms of what you're attracted to, what you're repulsed by. So I'm just kind of, generally speaking, kind of interested in all of that stuff, you know? I mean, for better or for worse. It's like what I'm interested in.
So, Le Rage, which we're looking at now, also obviously has become superhuman in a way through some kind of process, or something has happened to make him this way, like the Incredible Hulk. And that kind of brings me back to the beginning of the PowerPoint, and I want to talk a little bit about music and how it kind of runs through everything you do. Like we have imagery of musicians, known and lesser known. Like we have Prince on the right, and we have HR from Bad Brains on the Prince on the left, HR from Bad Brains on the right, and of course you've also many times over kind of made clear that your ambition as a filmmaker is to kind of emulate what black music does in a way in cinema. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about what it is you think that black music does to you. It's a very big question, but like what it is what you're striving for.
Well, there's one aspect of it, and that's in the space of what it does to everybody, which is that it's mesmerizing, and everybody knows it's mesmerizing. You don't have to. Black music is the dominant cultural form of the 20th century. It's kind of indisputable. When I've even had the argument with people, sometimes people will say cinema maybe is a thing that you could hold up. I mean, Lord knows it's not painting or art, but you know what I mean? So it's black music in all its various manifestations, permutations, whether it be rock and roll, R&B, reggae, techno. I mean, it's all black music, and everybody knows it's black music. So it raises all kinds of complicated questions, like why is that? Why has everybody, regardless of what they think of black people, collectively acknowledged that black music is the shit? You know, like I was even having this conversation with this friend of mine, Darius James, and, you know, we were talking, I said, why do you think like vinyl recordings were black? Why did they stabilize into being black? Because early on when they're 78s and stuff, they're red and blue and all these other kinds of things. And I'm convinced that they became black because what they did on a fundamental level was allow white people to have black music in their houses without having black people in their houses. It allowed the music to split away from black bodies. And as a consequence, on some subliminal level, this is why it stabilized itself into being black. I mean, it sounds a little crazy, but it's no crazier than racism, say, for example, you know? So the first level at which is the level at which it is a universally, even if people want to argue the specifics of it, it's like even the fact that you are arguing it, it's almost affirmation of what I'm saying is true. And then the other level is very specific to me just as a black person. It's not like, it's the fact that it is the one space in which black people are fully actualized. Like we have a fairly good conception of what, in the space of musical production, what it means to be black, to be a black person. Because even though you could play something for people they've never heard before, and most people can immediately say that's black music or it's not, immediately. But black music is not one thing. It's not like reggae, where it's got a certain beat and you hear it over and over. And it's somewhat paradoxically, it's something that everybody can recognize at the same time that it's incredibly diverse and broad. You would never confuse James Brown with Jimi Hendrix, with Aretha Franklin, with Bob Marley, with Robert Hood. You know what I mean? I could literally sit here and just spin off names for 24 straight hours, and you would never confuse any of those people with the person I mentioned before them or that followed them. So it's incredibly broad and diverse, but at the same time, nevertheless, there's something at the core of it that's kind of unmistakable. I'm obsessed with what that is. Like, why is it that black music is so fascinating? Like, I think, I've speculated about it on a lot of levels. I think, and again, I've said this before, but I think that in Western civilization, black people are like, and have been for some time now, like the canary in the mine shaft, and to a degree that where black people have gone, where we've existed, the spaces we've existed in, and not just survived, but thrived in a way, or continued to grow or evolve inside of. Sometimes I'd say we've created culture in free fall, okay? Those spaces are spaces that increasingly everybody is going to be subjected to. Because we're all on the same ride together, we're just in the front seat. You know what I mean? We're a little like the test case. But migrant crisis, dissolution of family structures, being subjected to violence, certain kinds of sexual pathologies, like economic, dissipation, all these kinds of things are not just things that are happening to us. They're the things that are intrinsically bound up with being black. So where we've gone is where everybody's going. So I think because the music is the sort of inscription of that, the music is the sort of embodiment of that, I think that at core, that's one of the reasons at core why black music is mesmerized. Not just because it sounds good. Yeah, it sounds good, it's got a good beat. But on a deeper, almost psychoanalytical level, this is the message that's being sent back to the rest of the world. Like, this is what it looks like where we are. And so people do identify, and as I often remind myself and have to remind other people, is black people are human beings too. So the kinds of things that we've been subjected to and that we experience and how we respond to those experiences in the spaces that engendered us gives everybody a good indication of what the ride is going to be like, increasingly. So that's what I would say. So on one hand, it's like black music in its aesthetic power is a model. But on the other hand, I would say black music is one of the rare spaces in which black people have, I don't know if so much been allowed to, have been able to manifest in embodied terms some of the complexity of who they are. I mean, like music and athletics would be the two spaces where you wouldn't feel like black people are not out here saying like, wow, what would we be capable of? In basketball or in soccer, nobody's like imagining what we would be capable of. You can see what we're capable of. And so since there are so many spaces in which there are kind of interdictions, even in terms of black people participating, then it's interesting to me to just think about, because I'm a systems person, I'm super about systems and stuff, so I'm very interested in like, well, what are the precedents? And why are those precedents either actualized or unactualized? Why are they latent or erased, And so one of the more curious things about the space of art or visual art or material art, material expressivity, artifacts, paintings, sculptures, and things like that, is, goes back to one of my oldest citations of the Namjoon Paik thing of like the culture that's going to survive in the future is a culture you can carry around in your head, he said. And if you look at the experiences of black people, the Middle Passage and things like that, it's like on a slave ship, you can carry some things, but you can't carry architecture and you can't carry sculpture just because they're material, but you can carry musical practices, you can carry like bodily movement practices, you can carry oratorical proclivities, all those kinds of things you can carry with you on your nervous system. And not only do you get to carry those things or can you carry those things, but because they are so quantum in a sense, so fluid, so energy based, they can evolve in real time in response to the circumstance you have. So even if you could carry a pyramid on your back, you weren't going to be doing any modifications on it in the slave ship. You know what I mean? Or even after, being off the slave ship, you're just not, because of the material dimensions of it. So it's that one fact, which I think everybody can kind of see that. So if you look at the Black American community, the spaces where we are really strong are in the spaces of what I would term immaterial invention. So that's one aspect of it. Music, dance, oratorical things. But that is in the face of the fact that in Africa, from which we came, about the only thing that has the depth and diversity and power of Black African musical culture is African material expressivity. So it's not like we didn't come from anywhere where that was. We came from somewhere where that was as prevalent and as predominant as the musical complexity and diversity. Meaning, and we know that there is no, and I've said this 100,000 times at this point, there's no contemporary Western art practice that exists independent of the impact of African aesthetics on Western art practice. It radically transformed Western art practice. Is no going back. It's a change that you can't get around. I mean, like increasingly you can't get around it. And then there are all these sort of residual or secondary versions of it as well. And we're constantly seeing these things pop up, like everything from what's the last new visual art form of the 20th century? It's clearly like wild style subway graffiti. I don't care what you think about it. It's not about whether you value it to be good art or bad art or anything like that. It's just like, that's the last new thing of the 20th century. Subway graffiti. And it's so powerful as a visual form that outside of any kind of economic superstructure, we're not talking about there were no patrons, there are no people by and large buying these things. You can go to any city in Europe and that subway graffiti is everywhere. It's on walls, it's on abandoned walls, right? So that means that thing has a viral dimension, just like the music, that's kind of undeniable. So, and then even something like, these women, like the quilts of G's Being, like if you're familiar, like these basically washerwomen, Black washerwomen from Alabama, have this tradition of making these quilts. And these quilts are literally like beyond anything. They are clearly as advanced, if not more advanced, than any abstract art that was made in America. And it's kind of undeniable when you see them. They had a show at the Whitney, it was undeniable. And it created a fissure that nobody talked about. Because all the artists who saw the show were saying, yo, this is some different shit. It has to be dealt with. The implications of it have to be dealt with. But all the art historians were running out to space because it was going to force them to completely reformulate the history of at least minimally American art in the 20th century. Because these women hadn't seen Kandinsky. You know what I mean? They hadn't seen Pollock. And nevertheless, you're looking at this abstract sophistication that, again, matches, if not supersedes, anything that any legitimate artist produced in the 20th century. So this whole thing of visual or, Cornel West was the person who pointed he made some of these connections for me early on. He said, he was talking about Black music and Black culture and all this kind of stuff. Somebody asked him, well, what about Black visual culture? And he said, it's not that apparent. And it caused a real shitstorm at the time because the Black visual artists said, oh, Cornel is speaking from ignorance, and he's just basically arming people who want to keep Black artists out of the space. I mean, one of my favorite artists, Donald Judd, there's a quote from him saying, Black people have already taken music and athletics. Why do they think they should take the visual thing as well? And I love Donald Judd, but that's you know what I mean? What do you make of that? I mean, I make of that statement is that he was a really smart dude and he knew what was happening. Yeah. He did not want these Negroes up in this space. He didn't want to be running in the space against Negroes, running the race. I mean, so, it's so complicated, this whole question, like I said, of the visual. And then, the last thing I'll say about it is, so you get these African artifacts, and they create all these they catalyze the space conceptually, formally, aesthetically, in all these ways, initially with Picasso and Matisse and these guys, and Duran, and they see these African artifacts, and then out of that, almost literally comes Cubism, of them trying to make sense of the formal dimensions of African artifacts. Not what they meant culturally, none of their symbolic significance, anything. Just the pure formal dimensions of it was so radically opposed to Western linear Renaissance perspective, which is essentially Eurocentric ideas mapped onto the visual space field. Okay, nothing wrong with it. A lot of great paintings came out of it, you know what I mean? But it is one way of structuring the universe visually speaking. And when they saw African art, it was really clear that this was another radically different conception of how you structure the visual field, because there's no single vanishing point in African artifacts. As a matter of fact, Cubism, in a sense, is a misunderstanding of African artifacts in the sense that when they saw them, they said, these are multiple vantage points stacked, you know, and hence Cubism, looking at an object from multiple perspectives at the same time. But in fact, in African art, it's not fixed vantage points at all. It's mobile vantage points. They just turned it into how they could understand it. As opposed to this, they understood it as this, and that points. Because that's how they could conceptually understand it. But then, again, as I've said many times, you know, Duchamp, who's the smartest dude in the room, you know, he saw the same thing, and he made, in some ways, a more literal translation of those implications with Nude descending the stairs, where you see a figure at the top and at the bottom of the stairs simultaneously. Because I do think he was smarter than anybody else in the room. He realized a lot of the power of these artifacts in this space was purely contextual. It was about how the artifacts were in tension with the conceptual underpinnings of Western art practice. And he set about to replicate that, and I think that's where the urinal came from. He just, how do I come up with a thing that I can put in these spaces that's gonna create this kind of energy? So, you know, a found object in the same way Black people were a kind of found object. In the same way, Black people's humanity was in tension with the structural presumptions of the context in which they found themselves. The urinal is in radical contention with the art space, because it's not art as we would classically define it. Everybody's still trying to figure out what's on the other side of Duchamp's urinal, you know, so. So in that way, it also is bound up with Black aesthetic practices and stuff. And then after that, you get jazz and Black music and shit, and it's all over, you know.
Yeah. I want to skip ahead a little bit just to make sure we have time to do the Q&A. So I was wondering if maybe we should talk about A Kingdom Cometh As, because we were talking as we were walking through yesterday through the exhibition. You said that it's one of the films that you've made that you keep watching over and over from beginning to end, even though it's quite a long film. It's like a feature film length, an hour and 45 minutes. And it's mainly made up of found recordings of gospel music
right.
Except for the little
bars and stuff.
Could you? I think what I wanted to ask you was, what is your relationship to that space, like your own relationship to the church, and like
which space?
Yeah.
Well, you know. I'm hesitant, you know, I'm constantly speaking about Black people, and I'm also very anxious about speaking for Black people or something like that. So, you know, my grandmother, she would have never used the word like Black experience. And in the 80s, there was this whole anti-essentialist thing that came, I think mostly derived from Stuart Hall's really incredible writings. And I was most exposed to it by friends of mine who were very interested in this whole idea of anti-essentialism. And all that just meant was, you know, the problematic with these notions of what Blackness was in any essential or fundamental fashion, and how by using even the term like Black, maybe in some ways we were being complicit in the sort of limiting or restrictive or constraining dimensions of it. We were actually participating in it. But I can remember in my early 20s, Stuart Hall, who came up with the term and the concept, he was gave a talk, and I had a talk afterwards. I remember he came, it was the last time I ever spoke to him. I didn't know him very well. And he said, precisely because there's good essentialism and bad essentialism, which is funny to me because I was like, when my friends would say, oh, that's essentialist and we're anti-essentialist, at a certain point in the beginning when they were pointing out the problems of it, I was like, yeah, I get it. Maybe I'm a little anti-essentialist too. But eventually I realized I was against the anti-essentialist as much as I was against the essentialist. So I started terming myself an anti-essentialist, because I was like, what you guys are doing is projecting onto black people, meaning not intellectuals, but black people, crude essentialism. Because my grandmother knew the difference between, she didn't have to have a term like hybridity or anything like that. She knew the difference between what you would term a black experience and her experiences. And I've often said, when people say, what are you interested in something like this? I said, well, I'm interested in at least two things. One is the black experience and the other is the experience of black people. And they are not the same thing. They overlap in very complicated ways, but they're not the same thing, So with something like A Kingdom Cometh Fast, I mean, if I'm being really frank, honestly, I put it together in some ways. I mean, to the degree you can rationalize things that you were doing with no plan, Like Apex, I had a file of things I thought were dope. These are all church things. They started structuring themselves to a certain degree because you put them in order. Well, this should precede that, or that should follow this. And at some level, I think, to the degree that there was an intentional aspect of it, it was my response to the success of Love is the Message. Because I was trying to make something that was, in many ways, formally speaking at least, was not what Love is the Message was. It was no quick cuts. It was long. Like my hand as an editor was very light in it. I wanted to feel like something I just found online, some unauthored compilation of footage. But of course, you try to structure it in a fashion that accumulates power as you stick with it, And also for me, it was like, okay, you're having an art career. When I did Love is the Message, first of all, I never presumed it was going to be in the art world. When Gavin Brown contacted me, well, it was my friends initially, because my impulse was to put it online on YouTube. And all my friends were saying, don't put it on YouTube, like everybody. And one of my friends, a close associate, Khalil Joseph, because he had a copy of it, he took it to Basel with him.
Yeah, Love is the Message.
Love is the Message, and screened it at a private screening he had in Basel before his own work. And Gavin Brown was there, saw it, and said, well, what was that? And he said, oh, that's my friend AJ's thing. And Gavin just called me, and, and slowly but surely, that's how we ended up where we were. But on a certain level also, it's just to remind myself, oh, you can think your art is doing something, but like, for real, does it measure up to this? Like, there's 15 performances in that I pray I would ever make some art that would be approaching the power of those performances. So I not only think they're amazing performances, and that's what I mean, it's one of my few things, if I put it on, I'll look at the whole thing. Even if I'm not looking at it, I'll just let it play, because it's just such an incredible array of Black expressive power at its absolute pinnacle. And so it's just a way to keep myself honest with myself. Because, there's a lot of things out here I like, it's not like anybody knows me. I'm not out here just like, I just like Black art or something like that. It's like, I love Mark Rothko, is my favorite painter. Certainly one of my favorite artists, period, is Bernini. I get really disturbed sometimes if people have come at me so many ways around just Love is a Message alone, There's an impulse to construct it as like, socio-political primarily, or as like an extension of Black Lives Matter or something like that, which is, I could tell a bunch of stories about that, but like one of which was like early on, again, Khalil had a copy of it, and there was a Black Lives Matter group that was having a meeting at the Underground Museum. They sort of opened their space, and Khalil had Love is the Message playing, and then the organizers of Black Lives Matter kept coming back saying, what is this thing that's playing? You need to take this thing off. It's triggering. They kept saying it's triggering us, and I was like, great. It should be triggering, you know what I mean? But so there's this aspect of it that is, it's, yeah, you can construct it as being political because it is in the world. And it's about trying to be lucid about the status of black people in the world, or even more lucid about the status of me in the world, how I move through the world, how I understand the world. But it's not protesting anything. I'm not into, I'm going to show you what it's really like. I mean, this shit is collapsing in on itself. You know what I mean? So I don't think, I'm not going to spend my energy on that. I'm just trying to make evidence of the world as I understand it, as I experience it. But it's not trying to transform anybody's understanding of anything. You know, it's like Bob Marley says, like, he who feels it knows it. And I believe that. You know, I'm just like, you know, like people got very upset. Again, I said this earlier to one of the journalists, but of anything I've ever said in public, the one thing that got the most traction or pushback was when I casually said to a journalist that, oh, I wasn't speaking to white people in my work. And then it was like a day after that was the occasion of my first sort of press junket. I had never experienced that before, where they had 15 people and they all came to the same space and they sat me down. I had to speak to 15 journalists in a row, like 15 minutes each. And I would say of those 15 people, 13 of them, the first thing out of their mouths was like, you said you don't care what white people think about your work. And I was like, no, I didn't say that. I didn't say I don't care what white people don't think about my work. I said I'm not speaking to white people. And because I was in London at the time, I said by analogy, and I didn't have it for the first 5 people, but by the 5th person, I said, hey, look, just think of it like this. When Eric Clapton does Layla, which I think is the greatest hard rock love song ever. I love that song. When he does Layla, he's not singing to everybody. He's singing to Patty Boyd because he fell in love with his best friend's wife. So much so that his best friend said, dude, go for it. You know what I mean? He fell in love with George Harrison's wife, and he was so obsessed with her. And so that song is directed at her. Everybody else just listening in. We just listening in. That's why it's powerful, because it's not dispersed. It's not a dispersed, generalized statement about the world. It's something super specific. Yeah, of course, you can write an essay about what it says about male-female relations in the mid-'60s in Britain in a certain sector, rock stars who were working-class guys who got out. I mean, you could build all kinds of theses on top of it, but at the end of the day, it's by Eric Clapton trying to convince his best friend's wife to leave his best friend and come be with him. You know, and that's the power. That's the basis of his power. So I'm not doing anything no different than that. I mean, I'm just speaking to what I know. I'm not going to direct my work, because when you say the audience, that's an abstract thing in real time. That's an abstract thing. I mean, you could be making a specific work. I'm making this for my mama or something like that. But you have this abstract idea of who your audience is. But most people who make work, even with the audience in mind, it's an ideal audience. It's an audience that gets the complexity of what you're doing. It's like, why would I be making... If I listen to... I used this analogy again earlier today. If I listen to, Verdi or something, or Aida or something like that, I don't speak Italian. I don't know what the fuck they talking about, right? It doesn't mean it's not moving to listen to it. I mean, I know the narrative infrastructure if I go see the opera or something, but basically I'm just dealing with it on an intonational level. That's all right. That's all right. I don't know what the socio-political specifics of that time. I think great work, I love Bernini. I was going to say this early. Like, to me, if somebody looks at Love as a Message and they don't have a handle on Bernini, they're not going to never get the fullness of what's going on in it. Because if you see any of Bernini's torqued figures, and you look at Love as a Message with that in mind, you see it's like pedantically, obsessively replaying over and over torqued figures in space. Does it have a socio-political dimension? Yes, all art does. It doesn't matter whether it's Leonardo da Vinci or whatever. It's just that in time, the specifics of the politics recede. And what's left is things like forces, this force in opposition to that force. And that's what's contained in the work. And so Love is the Message, all its specifics of Black people in this society in time, hopefully sooner than later, that's going to recede. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm just saying what's going to be left at the end is like these people, this group of people had a very specific and powerful and intense and human experience, and it's there on display for folks to see.